Ethan Cole didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in systems, satellites that could read heat through thin mountain air, signals intelligence that could pull meaning out of silence, and an architecture so advanced that if a man existed within its reach, he could be found and eliminated. For nearly 20 years in the CIA's Special Activities Division, that belief had held. Bosnia proved it. Somalia reinforced it. Even in Afghanistan, where chaos blurred every line, technology eventually closed the gap. It always did. By early 2003, Cole was 41 and based at Bagram Airfield, working as a liaison between CIA paramilitary teams and Joint Special Operations units along the Afghan-Pakistan border. The Americans had built something unprecedented there, a layered intelligence system combining satellites, predator drones, signals intercept stations, and rapid strike capability into a single machine. Data refreshed constantly. Movement patterns were tracked and analyzed. If someone used a phone within hundreds of kilometers, it could be intercepted and translated in minutes. If a vehicle moved in daylight, it was seen. If a target was confirmed, helicopters could be airborne in under 15 minutes. The philosophy was simple: see everything, dominate everything. Then the British arrived. A squadron from 22 SAS deployed to Bagram with far less than what the Americans considered necessary. Fewer vehicles, older communications gear, lighter body armor. Their Land Rover 110s looked worn, like machines that had survived more than one war already. Their weapons were standard, reliable, but unremarkable. They carried fewer magazines, fewer electronics, fewer redundancies. To Cole, it didn't look like efficiency. It looked like risk. He wrote exactly that. His initial report described the British element as under-equipped for the operational environment. It wasn't meant as criticism, just a conclusion based on everything he had learned. In his world, capability scaled with resources. More sensors meant better awareness. More protection meant higher survivability. More firepower meant more control. The SAS didn't seem interested in scaling anything. At first, the difference felt philosophical. But in eastern Afghanistan, it became operational. The mountainous border region had turned into a blind spot. The terrain worked against surveillance: steep valleys, broken lines of sight, unpredictable conditions. But the real problem was adaptation. The enemy had changed. Senior Taliban and Al-Qaeda figures stopped behaving in ways technology could track. No phones, no radios, no convoys. They moved on foot, often at night, using routes known only to locals. Communication shifted to couriers. Information was carried, not transmitted. Patterns existed, but they were human, inconsistent, subtle, almost invisible from above. And yet the attacks continued. IEDs appeared along supply routes. Small, precise ambushes hit coalition patrols. Someone was organizing it. The network existed. The system just couldn't see it. That was the context in which the SAS presented their plan. It sounded simple. 4-man patrols. On foot. No vehicles. Minimal electronics. No constant communication. They would move at night, establish concealed observation posts, and stay there as long as needed. They would watch, not for hours, for days. When Cole asked what would happen if a patrol was compromised deep in the mountains without immediate support, the squadron commander didn't elaborate. No contingency briefing, no detailed fallback plan. Just a calm answer. We'll handle it. The first patrol deployed on March 11th. 4 operators, each carrying more weight than Cole considered sustainable for that terrain. They moved through the mountains at night, covering nearly 20 kilometers and climbing over 2,000 meters before reaching their position just before sunrise. Then they disappeared. From the operations center, their presence reduced to brief, coded transmissions, short bursts confirming they were still in place. No live feed, no continuous updates, just silence, broken every few hours. For 4 days, they didn't move. Cole had worked with elite units before. He understood discipline, patience, control. But this was different. This wasn't waiting for action. This was the action. Total stillness, controlled breathing, minimal movement. Every physical need managed without producing a detectable signature. No heat, no light, no unnecessary noise. One man always observing, documenting everything. It forced him to rethink what an active mission looked like. On the third night, something moved. A group crossed the valley below, armed, organized, disciplined. No lights, no communication. Under normal conditions, they would have gone completely unnoticed. The patrol didn't engage. That wasn't their role. They tracked direction, formation, equipment. They watched, and they recorded. The report they sent was brief. It didn't need to be longer. Days later, that observation led to a targeted operation. A key facilitator was captured. Documents and materials exposed a wider network operating across the region. The intelligence value exceeded what months of technical collection in that same area had failed to produce. For Cole, the result wasn't surprising. Operations succeeded all the time. What unsettled him was the method. 4 men. No advanced sensors, no constant surveillance, and yet they had seen what the system had missed. At first, he tried to explain it away. Maybe coverage had been misaligned. Maybe the drone had been redirected at the wrong moment. Maybe it was just timing. But that explanation didn't hold, because the SAS didn't treat it as exceptional. For them, it was routine. That was when the shift began. Not a rejection of technology, but a realization. There existed a category of problem where technology wasn't decisive, where visibility didn't come from sensors, but from presence, where understanding wasn't built through data, but through observation that couldn't be automated. Cole didn't abandon his belief in systems, but for the first time, he saw their limits. And in the mountains along that border, those limits mattered. The operation that changed everything didn't begin with movement. It began with absence. For 8 months, American intelligence had been tracking a figure known only by a code name, the pharmacist. He didn't appear in intercepted communications, didn't show up in drone footage, didn't generate patterns that software could recognize. And yet every time a network was partially exposed, traces of his work appeared. Weapons moved through routes no one could map. Explosives surfaced where no activity had been detected. People arrived exactly where they needed to be without ever being seen getting there. He wasn't visible, but his presence was constant, defined not by what he did directly, but by the structure he maintained behind everything else. By April 2003, frustration inside the operations center had started to build. Surveillance coverage had increased, more drones, more intercept platforms, more analysts, but the result stayed the same. Data kept flowing, yet the picture never completed itself. The system could collect endlessly, but it couldn't identify the one man holding the network together. That was the point where the SAS proposed something different. Not more coverage, but less reliance on it. Not trying to see everything at once, but placing men where something actually happened and allowing time to expose what technology couldn't. Operation Dovetail followed that logic. 2 4-man patrols would move into the mountains on foot, establish concealed observation positions, and remain there for as long as necessary. No constant communication, no electronic presence beyond short-burst transmissions, no dependence on immediate extraction. They would watch until the network revealed itself. Cole understood the objective, but not the scale. He asked to go with them and was refused immediately, not because of clearance, but because he wouldn't physically keep up. He trained with them for 3 weeks, and that was enough to understand the difference. These men didn't simply endure discomfort, they controlled it. Every movement conserved energy, every action was deliberate. They weren't faster, but over time, they didn't slow down. Cole could match them for hours, not for days, and that gap was decisive. The patrols stepped off on the night of April 14th. No vehicles, no air insertion. They walked 22 kilometers through mountainous terrain, climbing above 3,800 meters, where the air itself worked against them. Each man carried close to 70 kilograms, water, ammunition, optics, food for nearly 2 weeks. The movement took 9 hours in darkness, navigating without GPS, relying entirely on map, compass, and terrain memorized beforehand. They reached their observation positions before sunrise and disappeared into the ground, reducing their presence to something that could not be seen unless you were already looking for it. At first, nothing happened. Day 1 passed without movement. Day 2 remained empty. Day 3 followed the same pattern. Inside the operations center, doubt began to surface. Drone feeds showed no activity. Analysts started to question the mission quietly. From their perspective, the absence of movement meant there was nothing to find. One operator summarized it simply: if nothing had appeared in 3 days, nothing was there. Cole passed that assessment along. The SAS commander didn't argue. He simply said they hadn't looked properly. On the 4th night, that assumption broke. At 3:15, Patrol Alpha observed movement, 3 men crossing the valley. They weren't visibly armed, but they moved with purpose. They stopped briefly at a rock formation, less than 2 minutes, then continued without hesitation. On its own, it didn't look significant, but the patrol didn't dismiss it. They recorded timing, spacing, direction, behavior. When daylight came, one of the observers studied the rock through a long lens. A small mark had been scratched into its surface, something that hadn't appeared in any recent satellite imagery. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, but it was enough. A dead drop marker. That single detail changed the operation. It confirmed that the network had structure, not visible from above, not detectable through signals, but physical and consistent. The patrols didn't move. They didn't need to. Over the next nights, the valley began to reveal itself. Movement appeared between 0200 and 0500, always on foot, always controlled, always without electronic communication. Individuals and small groups passed through along the same routes, with variations that became predictable over time. The patrols documented everything, not just who moved, but how. gait, posture, the way weight was carried, the rhythm of movement. These details, invisible to sensors, became identifiers through repetition. Across the following days, a pattern formed. 14 individuals were tracked through repeated observation. 7 dead drop sites were identified. 3 compounds emerged as temporary nodes. Timing became structured, a 7-day cycle, routes rotating with consistency. None of it triggered alerts. None of it appeared significant from above. But on the ground it was clear. Cole watched it form through short transmissions, fragments that built into a complete picture. It didn't look impressive in isolation. No clear imagery, no immediate target. Just notes. But the pattern held, and that made it real. On the 9th day, the network revealed its center. At 3:42, Patrol Bravo observed 3 men entering the valley. One of them moved differently, a slight, consistent limp in his left leg. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it matched a detail from earlier intelligence reports linked to the pharmacist. That was enough. The patrol didn't react. They observed. The man stopped at a dead drop for just over 2 minutes, then moved to a compound already under watch. Timing, behavior, route, everything aligned. The identification didn't rely on a clear image. It relied on consistency built over days of observation. The transmission they sent lasted 9 seconds. Coordinates, personnel count, observed weapons, recommended timeline. Within 18 hours, a joint strike force moved, SAS and Delta, fast and controlled. The compound was hit before dawn. The pharmacist was captured alive. Inside, they found what months of surveillance had failed to produce: documents, routes, names, connections that extended the network across multiple regions. For Cole, the result confirmed something he had resisted. The system hadn't failed. It had simply been looking in the wrong way. Everything it needed had been there, moving through the same terrain, following consistent patterns. But those patterns weren't designed for machines to detect. They required presence, patience, and observation sustained long enough to remove doubt. And it took 8 men, lying in the dirt for 12 days, to see it. What stayed with Cole wasn't the capture. It wasn't the reports, or the intelligence value, or the clean execution of the final assault. He had seen successful operations his entire career. Targets were found, networks were broken, missions ended the way they were supposed to. That part was familiar. What he couldn't process was what it had taken to get there. Not the plan, not even the patience, the endurance. Operation Dovetail hadn't been a raid. It had been 12 days of controlled suffering, and the details only became clear when Cole read the patrol reports line by line. They were written without emotion, stripped down to facts, but the reality behind them was impossible to ignore. By day 6, the temperature had dropped to nearly -20 degrees. There was no adjustment, no relocation, no attempt to improve conditions. The patrols stayed in position, inside shallow scrapes dug into frozen ground, covered by netting and rock. They couldn't light stoves, couldn't heat water, couldn't risk even the smallest thermal signature. So they didn't. They stayed still and absorbed the cold. The equipment helped, but only to a point. Sleeping bags slowed heat loss. They didn't stop it. The cold wasn't something they escaped from. It was something they controlled. Shivering was managed, not eliminated. Movement was reduced to the absolute minimum. One operator reported his water freezing inside the bladder. He didn't discard it. He spent hours thawing it against his body, holding it close until it became usable again. There was no backup for that. If the water stayed frozen, he didn't drink. Food intake was reduced deliberately to keep weight down. They were operating below caloric requirements in freezing conditions, losing weight steadily, accepting it as part of the mission rather than a problem to solve. And through all of it, they barely moved. That was the part Cole kept returning to. Movement would have helped. Even small adjustments could generate heat, relieve pressure, keep muscles from locking. But movement created risk, so they removed it. Hours passed with almost no change in position. Muscles stiffened, circulation slowed, joints tightened. They adjusted only when necessary, and even then in movements so small they would be invisible from a distance. Discomfort wasn't something they reacted to. It was something they absorbed. On day 8, that discipline was tested in a way no training environment could simulate. In the early afternoon, a local goat herder entered the valley. It wasn't part of any pattern. It wasn't expected. The man moved slowly, his animals spreading out across the terrain, drifting without direction. Patrol Alpha tracked the movement as the herd came closer, 10 meters, then less. At 7 meters, concealment stopped being theoretical. It became absolute. The patrol didn't move. The herder remained in the area, close enough that any reaction would have been visible. One of the goats stepped directly onto the camouflage netting, covering the patrol commander's legs. The weight pressed down, shifting the material slightly. Any reflex, even a small adjustment, would have exposed them instantly. There was no reaction. Breathing slowed. Muscles locked. Every instinct that demanded movement was suppressed. The herder stayed in the area for over 40 minutes, his animals moving unpredictably around the position. The patrol remained completely still the entire time. Then he left. No detection, no suspicion, nothing. When Cole read that part of the report, he paused. Not because of what had happened, but because of how it was written. No emphasis, no indication of stress, just a sequence of events, recorded the same way everything else was recorded. But the meaning was clear. This wasn't just discipline. It was control at a level he hadn't seen before, not under fire, not in movement, but in complete stillness. The days that followed didn't get easier. Fatigue built slowly and stayed. Sleep came in short rotations, 2 hours at a time, one man always awake, always observing. There was no full rest, no recovery period. The body adapted by lowering output, conserving energy wherever possible. Reaction speed slowed, but observation didn't. That was the requirement. If something moved in that valley, it had to be seen, regardless of how long they had been there or how depleted they were. And they didn't miss anything. That consistency was what separated the operation from anything Cole had experienced. Not the success, but the absence of failure. 12 days without compromise. 12 days without a single mistake that mattered. In an environment where everything pushed toward exposure, cold, fatigue, proximity, they maintained the standard. Back at the base, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The American system depended on movement, data flowing, targets shifting, patterns updating. It was powerful, but it required constant input. Without change, it stalled. The SAS operated differently. They removed change from themselves and let it happen around them. They didn't chase the network. They waited for it to move, and when it did, they were already in position. By the end of the operation, Cole wasn't comparing methods anymore. He wasn't deciding which approach was better. That question didn't apply. What he had seen wasn't an alternative to the system. It was something the system couldn't replicate, a capability built on patience, endurance, and control over the body and mind that couldn't be scaled or accelerated. When the patrols finally moved out after 12 days, they did it the same way they had come in, on foot, quietly, without support. There was no visible end to the mission, no moment that marked completion. They simply left the valley, carrying the result with them. From the outside, the operation looked efficient, clean, successful. From Cole's perspective, it looked like a limit. Not of what men could do, but of what technology couldn't replace. By the time Cole left Bagram, nothing had changed on paper. The system continued to operate the way it always had. Satellites in orbit, drones in the sky, analysts feeding data into a network that never stopped processing. Targets were still being identified, strikes still being authorized, intelligence still flowing through the same channels. If someone looked at the war from above, it would appear unchanged. But Cole didn't see it the same way anymore, because he had seen something that didn't fit into that system. The patrols from Operation Dovetail had returned without celebration, without announcement. There were no photos, no footage, no visible markers of what they had done. They simply reappeared, debriefed, and disappeared again into the structure of their unit. The intelligence they brought back didn't arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It came as fragments, observations, patterns, behavioral details that analysts slowly stitched together over time. But those fragments led to results. Networks were mapped more accurately. Movement patterns became predictable. Supply routes were intercepted earlier. The system improved, not because it became more powerful, but because it had finally been shown something it couldn't generate on its own. Cole requested access to the full after-action material. He went through it repeatedly, not looking for mistakes, but trying to understand the structure beneath it. The more he read, the clearer it became that the success wasn't built on technology or even intelligence in the traditional sense. It was built on time to observe, time to wait, time to let the network reveal itself instead of forcing it to appear, and time, most importantly, to endure. He compared that to what he had believed before. In his world, time was a constraint, something to minimize. Missions were designed to reduce exposure, shorten engagement windows, and maximize efficiency. The faster you acted, the less risk you carried. That principle had guided every operation he had been part of. But what he had seen in the mountains didn't follow that logic. Those patrols didn't reduce time. They used it. They turned it into an advantage. That was the shift. Not a rejection of technology, but a redefinition of its role. The system could process information faster than any human. It could track signals, analyze movement, and identify patterns across vast distances. But it couldn't create the conditions necessary for certain types of information to exist in the first place. That required presence, real presence. Not a sensor hundreds of meters above the ground, but a man lying in the dirt for days, watching the same valley long enough for the truth to reveal itself. Cole wrote his final assessment in stages, not because it was difficult to describe, but because it required him to separate what he had believed from what he had seen. He didn't criticize the system. He didn't dismiss it. He simply described its limits. Technology extended awareness, but it didn't replace observation. Speed increased reaction, but it didn't replace patience. Firepower controlled space, but it didn't replace presence. And presence in that environment was decisive. He ended the report with a simple conclusion. In certain conditions, human observation, sustained over time, produces intelligence that no system can replicate. It wasn't presented as revolutionary. It didn't need to be. The results spoke for themselves. What remained with him after that wasn't the success of the operation, but the silence that surrounded it. There was no moment where everything came together in a visible cinematic way. No explosion of clarity, no single turning point that solved the problem instantly. Instead, there had been 12 days of quiet, controlled effort that led to a result no amount of technology had achieved on its own. That, more than anything, stayed with him. Years later, when Cole was asked about the British SAS, he didn't talk about equipment or training. He didn't compare units or capabilities. He spoke about discipline, about control, about the ability to remain in a position, in total stillness, for long enough that the environment itself began to give away its secrets. He described it simply. "They don't chase the target," he said. "They wait until the target has no choice but to come to them." It wasn't a tactic. It was a mindset. And it worked in places where everything else struggled. The war didn't end. It never really does. It just changes shape. Networks adapt. Tactics evolve. New systems are built to counter old ones. The cycle continues. But somewhere in those mountains a different kind of war had been fought. One that didn't rely on overwhelming force or constant motion, but on patience, silence, and the ability to remain unseen long enough to understand what others couldn't. Cole understood that now, not as theory, but as fact. And once you've seen that kind of capability in action, you don't look at the system the same way again, because you know exactly what it can't do, and more importantly, what it can never replace.